a second.
According to the big little bug up there, it's saying that we are live.
Yeah, I think we are. So, all right. Welcome to Blitzscaling, a startup. I am Julien Newman.
And I am Chris Yeh.
And we have new fancy software that I apparently don't know how to use. Although I did test it with a person. So I tried to get to be good to use it, but I failed.
That's okay. It seems to be working, and as long as people can see us, that's what matters.
So, Chris, as you know, this is my last day, or maybe you don't know. This is my last day in Chiang Mai,
Oh my.
Thailand. And then I'm going to a small border town called Mai Sot tomorrow, which is one of the places in the world the most illegal border crossings. It's like filled with like Burmese people who come in illegally to
Any
Thailand
particular
to work.
reason why you're going to this border crossing town?
Yeah, well, partially it's halfway between Chiang Mai and Bangkok, so it splits my my trip into two.
Mm-hmm.
And then partially I really want to eat Muslim food, and they have a lot of Muslim food there. And then partially I just want to see what that town is like, because it's a unique place, and I like weird places like that. So
Got it. Now, to travel from Chiang Mai to Bangkok, are you taking a train, bus, car? How do you? Because obviously, since you're stopping in this town, you're not taking an airplane.
Yeah, exactly. So my neighbor is driving us, and then from Mai Sot, we're going to take a bus.
Got it. Very cool. How long a bus ride is that? Never gone on a bus in Thailand before.
Yeah, I think it's like 5 hours to.
Well, that's not too bad.
Yeah, exactly. So kind of breaking it up that way makes it, more. And then the other thing is it gives us, like, my wife and I, like, actual vacation time together. So usually I'm just working all the time. Even the last month, Chris, as you know, I was deathly sick, but I was still coming to our recordings, and I was high energy, I hope, most of the time.
Yeah, no, you were able to do that, but it's noticeable that you are looking and feeling better now, which is, of course, to be expected. And I will have to say, I don't know if riding on a bus in Thailand is this some sort of honeymoon bus or something? It doesn't sound that romantic.
Yeah, I mean, Kelly and I, the first time we met, we met up together in Reno, Nevada, because I really want to go
The
to
pawn
Reno.
shop capital of the world.
Yeah, I just really like, let's say, working class things as my style.
Well, it's good to have inexpensive tastes. Nothing wrong with that.
So, okay, our topic today, Chris, is super top of mind for me.
Mm-hmm.
What it is should is it as true today as it was in the past that you should be US focused as a US based startup? So I'll tell you, there's a company that's very popular in Southeast Asia. It's called Line. It's like a WhatsApp competitor.
That's right.
And WhatsApp too, Line and WhatsApp, they were both companies that were global first. So from day one, they were global. They didn't target the local market. They were global first. Most US-based startups don't do that because they have a big local market. Line is in Japan, so they don't have a big local market. But there's this kind of global first playbook that, or global early playbook that exists, in Japan and Israel, stuff like that. And that's not what US-based startups do, and I think for good reasons.
That's right.
I've noticed there are, Discord is a recent startup that's super successful.
Oh, yes.
That, is very global, and was very global from day one, and that's in part due to their user base. So I just want to kind of like understand, have things changed? Like, is there a reason to be global first or global earlier versus 10 years ago? And then, how do you decide like whether you should like how early you should be like going outside the US market?
Perfect. All right. So this is going to be a nuanced discussion because there are a variety of factors at work. And the short answer is that most US startups should still focus on the US market, but not all. And it is becoming more and more important and easier to go global earlier. So let's sort of work through the series of factors that's involved. The first is that all other things being equal, it is easier to grow in a local market that you know well than in non local markets that you don't. And that's why it's a big advantage for companies to be US companies or potentially Chinese companies or what have you. One of the things that I like to point out in blitzscaling is there are only a small number of countries in the world that have large enough economies for you to serve as a home market that supports blitzscaling. The United States being the foremost one, China and India sort of being in that range. And I often tell people the smallest you can get is probably Brazil, because Brazil has served as a launching pad for Latin America, even though there's some language issues involved with Portuguese versus Spanish and so on. So if you are from a country with a smaller than 250 million population and without sufficient middle class, then you probably have to think regionally or even globally from the start, just because there's no alternative. And what has been happening is that more and more markets can support a company these days than once upon a time. Once upon a time, it was just the United States. China was nowhere to be found. India was nowhere to be found. And these days, there's been enough global growth and enough progression of technology, education, the middle class, such that it's possible to build a regional strategy around Latin America, around the Middle East, and around Southeast Asia, where you are right now, and so on and so forth. So that's the big difference. But it is still the case that all other things being equal, the bigger the market, the better. The more homogenous the market, the better. The more open the market, the better. And it's still the case that the best thing is to be an American company overall. Now, one of the things you mentioned is there are a number of companies that were global first. But I want you to think about the companies that you mentioned, and then we'll go back to an even older company because it's the first example I saw of this. You mentioned companies like WhatsApp and Line and Discord. What they all have in common is they are communications platforms. And communications platforms where they are making it easier to communicate with people across national boundaries. So let's dial the clock all the way back to the late 1990s to one of the early success stories of the internet wave, and that is Skype. Skype is a company that sprang up from Scandinavia, not exactly a big market. But what they did was they created, using at the time peer to peer technology, an ability to make international phone calls. Now, again, this is so long ago. It's nearly 30 years ago. It's at least 25 years ago. And the people who are listening in may not even know that once upon a time, the only way to communicate real time via voice with someone in another country was an international long distance phone call. And
Which
those
costs like
phone
$3
calls,
a minute.
exactly, those phone calls will cost multiple dollars per minute. I mean, literally, one phone call would be larger than your entire phone bill for a month these days. And so people would go to extreme lengths in order to avoid paying these charges. And again, I was telling my kids about this because it's probably hard for them to understand since my son is on Discord every day with friends scattered around the world. That in those days, because it was so expensive, you literally corresponded with people via letter, international airmail. And you would physically write letters, and there were these blue envelopes that were specifically designed for airmail. And it was basically the envelope and the letter were unified to minimize weight. And these were the things that you sent to people. It still costs more money, but it only cost $1 for like an entire letter as opposed to several dollars per minute. And of course, a letter could be pretty long. So, what these global first companies have in common is they're tapping into the same thing that Skype tapped into, which is when it comes to international communication, then you can go global very early on. In fact, it's advantageous to go global because that's where your greatest advantage is. Using Skype to call someone 3 blocks away didn't make sense in those days. There was more overhead involved in having your computer, hooking up to the internet, having headphones on, making sure they had a Skype account, and so on and so forth. But for talking with your mom in Sweden while you were in the United States so that you didn't have to pay hundreds of dollars a month or rely just on airmail, totally compelling. So I think I want to caution you that the examples that you give are all a specific case. In the case of live real-time communications, there is a massive advantage to going global first because of the fact that the alternatives are difficult. Now, over time, you can WhatsApp call, you can Discord, you can do all of these different things. The main reason that Discord has been successful as the latest entrant is because it works for groups much more easily than WhatsApp or Line or what have you. And so Discord becomes a community phenomenon and people use it to talk in groups, basically have parties and things like that. That's also very cool. But again, this is an exception, not the rule. In general, local market better. In general, the larger the market, the better. In general, American companies should focus on America first because the United States is the single largest market, the single most valuable market.
Yeah, I think that's insightful. It's kind of like WhatsApp. I know specifically their entire value proposition was you can send text messages to people outside of your country for
Yes.
free instead of at the time it cost like $2 or something to send a international text message. So like for companies where the value prop is global communication, let's say, obviously it makes sense to go global first, and
Yes.
that's kind of its own case in many ways.
Correct. So, for example, Amazon did not immediately say, oh, let's sell in every country. Amazon focused on America first and then expanded from there. And even there, it's not universal. For example, I'm going to be speaking at a conference in the Bahamas in January, just a couple weeks away now. And when I tried to find a way to ship books there, I couldn't. Amazon doesn't serve the Bahamas.
Okay, here we get into kind of like sequencing, an issue around sequencing. And the issue, my question around sequencing is, let's say you're eBay, okay, and you start with this really, really narrow thing, which is tie, beanie, whatever it was.
Beanie Babies, yes. There was I believe there was a movie made about them recently.
So that was their initial segment, which was, hey, tie Beanie Babies, collectors in the United States, presumably, was their initial market. And I get that eBay's they have real constraints around global shipping and stuff like that. So it's like probably for eBay specifically, they'd want to stay US focused for that reason. But when I guess my question is when is it that you'd want to stay super focused on tie Beanie Babies? This would be like the tie Beanie Baby platform for America, Canada, Europe, let's say, before going outside of tie Beanie Babies and becoming a more horizontal platform or sequencing other market segments.
Right.
And I understand that eBay, it would be obviously the US because there are geographical constraints to shipping, just make everything more complex, which presumably is one of the criteria. But how would you think through when to sequence geographies versus sequence, other types of market segments?
Yes. So the first thing, of course, is geography relevant? In the case of shipping physical goods, it obviously is. In the case of a communication system, I don't believe it is. I don't think that WhatsApp had to have some sort of country by country rollout strategy per se. I think WhatsApp needed a language by language rollout strategy, but not a country by country rollout strategy. So I think that let's assume that there's some geographical component. Assuming there is that component, then there are two factors that are competing against each other, pushing against each other, and that tension determines when you should expand. The first is something that you referenced, which is it is better to dominate a market first rather than just be competitive in a variety of different markets. It's a much stronger competitive position to be the dominant player in one market than to be an also-ran in many markets. And so, in general, your goal should be focus on your home market until you achieve a dominant position. And as we talk about in blitzscaling, thanks to network effects and other things like that, once you have won a winner take most market, it's almost impossible for someone to take it away, as you can witness by seeing eBay and Craigslist and other things like that. So that's one force. But the other force is the force of competition, because what is good for what is good for the goose is also sauce for the gander, as the saying goes. I really don't like the taste of geese. I don't know why people use that expression, but nonetheless, that's the expression. And so if you can win your winner take most market in America, then other people can win their winner take most market in their country or their region. And this has proven to be one of the formulas of success for folks like the Somver brothers of Rocket Internet, which is to say, let's find business models that work. Let's go ahead and create the European equivalents, and let's hold those markets hostage and extract money from the American companies, or alternately just build out the European version. And even though it won't be as valuable as the American version, it could still be worth many billions of dollars.
Yeah,
And so
where I am right now in Thailand, when I was here 15 years ago, they had Uber. Or they were just starting to have Uber. Like it was like early. Like I used one of the like earliest Ubers. While now there's no more Uber. Uber has left the market because they were beaten out by local like Grab, essentially, which is a Southeast
exactly,
Asian.
Grab is dominant in Southeast Asia. And again, this was a delicate balance that Uber had to strike, right? Uber went after different markets, and let's think about 3 different markets beyond the United States. Uber pushed very hard for the China market. They believed that that was going to be one of the biggest markets in the world. They're correct about that. They went head to head against Didi. Didi is actually a result of a merger of several other players. And they were locked in this deadly competition that was costing both companies billions of dollars. And the government, the PRC, essentially said, that's it, we're freezing the competition. It's over. Because they passed a law saying you could no longer subsidize rides, which was the only way to compete. And so Uber ended up having to concede the China market to Didi, but in the process got a 20% stake in Didi. So all's well that ends well, so to speak. It's disappointing for them, but it's still better than nothing. In contrast, and this reflects the different market dynamics, what Uber did instead in the Middle East is to buy the leading Uber clone in the Middle East, Careem. And by buying Careem, Uber now has the dominant position in the Middle East and the big brand that exists there. And again, as we saw in the Southeast Asia market, it's the worst of both worlds. They competed, they lost, they didn't get a piece of Grab. So it shows you that competition matters. Now, the thing is that Uber had its own serious competition in the United States as well because of Lyft. And so do I think that Uber was wrong to emphasize its competitive stance in the United States versus these other markets? I can't really say that for certain, because if they had devoted all their resources to international expansion and allowed Lyft to take over the American market, then they would be less valuable as well. Because again, it's harder for Uber to succeed in these different regions because of the fact that the founder and senior management team are not familiar with the region, because of the fact that there's a tendency to prefer national champions, and the governments themselves, as we saw as the case of the government of the PRC, will favor a national champion. And so it is harder to grow in other markets than it is in your home market. And so that's why there are all these different factors involved. It's not a simple yes or no answer.
I assume the core underlying dynamic is one of referenceability or word of mouth, right? Where it's like, so if you're Uber and you dominate the San Francisco market, people in San Francisco talk to each other about Uber, and that gives you free distribution, right? And let's say you're a B2B business and you dominate the US B2B market. Well, all the relevant customers will talk to each other about you, and customers like enterprise buyers in the US reference enterprise buyers in the US. They don't really care what enterprise buyers in Nigeria are doing. And similarly, people in San Francisco, and they're taking cabs, they don't really care what people in Bangkok are doing to take their cabs. So
Right.
it's kind of like creating this dynamic around word of mouth. So in some markets, people so there's you mentioned that there are certain businesses where their entire value prop is collaborate with people across borders, right?
Mm-hmm.
WhatsApp, an example. But there are some markets where the users may reference, like, not care that much about geography when referencing
That's
each
right.
other's.
That's
I'll,
right.
I'll give you an example that I'm interested in, and obviously that we're kind of living right now, which is content creators. So
Mm-hmm.
my assumption is, or my belief or my experience is, that let's say if you take business oriented podcast type content creators, let's say me and you,
Mm-hmm.
we will reference a business oriented content creator in the UK and in Sweden. Like, we'll see those and talk to those and be more aware of those more than we would a beauty content creator in San Francisco. So, like, how would you, like, does that matter? When does it
Mm.
matter? How does that play out? And what does that dynamic tell us?
Yes. So, what you're touching on is the dynamic of branding and the dynamic of network effects. And the fact is that geography is not the only factor. The industry or the focus or the topic also is, because I agree. I think the caveat would be that we would probably only find out about those content creators who are creating content in English or languages that we could speak. If we did not have direct contact or ability to understand, it would be difficult. This is actually one of the big disadvantages that Americans have relative to the Chinese, which is that most of the entrepreneurs in China have the ability to understand English and can at least roughly intuit what's going on. Whereas very few American entrepreneurs understand Chinese and have no access to Chinese podcasts or Chinese language newspapers or other things like that. By the way, I actually think that AI will help bridge that gap. If you think about it, AI translation will make it easier and easier for people to learn from different cultures all across the world. But
Well,
let's
one
come
one
back.
of the
Mhm.
one of the challenges too with the Chinese ones is that you can't get an account without a Chinese phone number.
That's right. And by the way, one of the challenges I had with Grab, which you may have been able to get around because I was only visiting briefly, I could not get a Grab account because I need a Thai, at least in Thailand, I needed a Thai bank account in order to set up a Grab account. And I'm not going to be here long enough to set up a bank account. And it doesn't make sense for me to set up a bank account. This is ridiculous. And so I couldn't use Grab, which was unfortunate because it would have been very convenient. So let's talk about the dynamic though. So the dynamic here is that the markets are what they are. The geography is the primary overlay, but there are secondary overlays, as we said, the topic of interest, the language, and things like that. So it's important not to get so caught up and believe that national boundaries are the be all end all. Really, the market definition is the pool of people who are referencing each other within that pool where the brand matters, within that pool where interactions and transactions take place. And what you need to do is you need to figure out what that actually is. And so, for example, think about the geography of Uber versus the geography of Airbnb. So, with the geography of Uber, what happens is there is an advantage to Uber being in more places. And I generally believe that if I'm traveling somewhere else in the world, it is more likely that Uber will work than that Lyft will work. I believe that's pretty accurate statement. And that gives Uber an advantage for the international traveler. Somebody like me is more likely to use Uber than Lyft precisely for that reason. However, on the other hand, with Airbnb, if we look at it, we're like, well, am I more likely to use Airbnb in all these places? The answer is even more so than Uber. And that is because when it comes to Airbnb traveling around the world, now all of a sudden I actually care about the ratings. I care about the nature of the place. I'm more worried about being scammed than I would be with Uber. And so Airbnb actually gets more referenceability across territories than an Uber does. And it's because the nature of the product itself is different.
So when I was building my last business, Dedicated, we would only sell to Americans. Like, I would never ever talk to anybody who's non-American.
Mm-hmm.
I tried at some point, but very quickly abandoned it. It's like, especially enterprise buyers, like American enterprise buyers are just so much easier to sell to than everybody else, and there are
Mm-hmm.
specific dynamics that we don't have to get into. But
Yep.
then what we so 100% of our sales effort was, the US, right? And but what would happen is we would work with global businesses. So the most global business that we had was a company called Publicis Group.
One of the world's
Um,
largest advertising agency holding companies.
yeah, they're the largest now
Mm.
through acquisition.
Got it.
Um,
I haven't tracked the industry as closely. Once upon a time, Publicis was one of the top players along
yeah,
with Omnicom and WPP. What was the recent merger that put them over the top?
they did a bunch of. They went on an acquisition spree. So it was
Mm.
originally essentially what happens.
Publicis is
WPP,
originally a French
yeah,
company. WPP sort of lost its way. It was always poorly
correct.
managed, but once Sir Martin Sorrell was canceled for his bad behavior, it lacked its driving force.
Exactly. So kind of like WPP was a leader, and then as you say, they had a bunch of problems. So Publicis kind of got more steam and had like these businesses that are driven by M&A. So like, why would you want to be acquired by WPP if they're having a bunch of problems, etc.
That's
So
right.
that I think that's what drove it. But anyway, so they were so Publicis. So we were US only in our go to market. So
Hmm.
distribution is US, 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 US. But let's say Publicis, they'd say, well, this is working great in the US market. How about we get the French people and the Australians and the MENA, so Dubai based people on board as well.
Hmm.
And you're not going to say like, no, I don't want to work with your other branches. So that was kind of the go to market motion that worked for us, just distribution in the US and then kind of like expand globally through seats, like just like seat growth.
Right.
Um,
That makes sense.
and maybe, and I want to kind of like wrap this up. The takeaway is, so you're a US based startup, okay,
Yeah.
and you focus on the US market first, and then you want to be very thoughtful about how does your actual market function and how are you
Hmm.
going to create as much value as possible and grow as cheaply as possible given the real dynamics of the market, while having a bias for your local market, but being open to, going with whatever, wherever the market is pulling you.
Yes. So the key is that there are no hard and fast rules. There are no binaries, right? What you have is as you put it, a dynamic situation, and in the definition of dynamic, in the sense that there are different dynamics in play, different forces at work, and you need to be thoughtful about what is that combination of forces at work in your market, which means being able to correctly define your market and really understand it. If somebody said, this is a US company, so it should focus on the US, and they were running WhatsApp or Skype, that would be the wrong idea. But on the other hand, if you were running something like Uber and you said, I must focus on heading off international competition at all costs, you might end up giving up your US market to a more focused competitor. And so, what you have to do is you have to identify all the dynamics in play, evaluate them, and then make a thoughtful decision, which may still end up being wrong, right? There's no guarantee that just because you have the right framework for thinking about things, that you'll make the right decision and that right decision will lead to the right outcome. but you'll be in a much better position than somebody who is, as I put it, taking the Harry Potter approach to life. So Harry Potter is a wizard, and wizards cast spells by saying certain words like expecto patronum. And every time you say expecto patronum, the spell just sort of works. And that's the way magic. It's just arbitrary and random. It follows a rule, like something written in a rule book. Well, you can't just say expecto global or something like that and expect it to work the same way every time. You actually have to explore the dynamics, evaluate them, make human judgments, and then do the best you can.
So when you're thinking about those dynamics, one that would be really important is the financial value of a user or a customer, right? So it's kind of like if your Discord and your monetization is you charge users $5 a month or for these like weird things that they charge. I'm not sure how it works, but it's a relatively small amount of money to a lot of people. It's realistic for Discord to expect a kind of person in Chennai to pay $5. While, let's say, if you're Amazon, the person in Chennai is going to spend a lot less in terms of like actual dollars.
That's right.
Than the person in San Francisco, just because they're just like there's just less money sloshing around. Same thing for like Uber. Like Uber's charges like $200 per ride in New York. They're not charging $200 per ride in India because no
most
one's
definitely
paying
not.
That. So like they're 15% on $200, a lot more money than 15% on $5. So to like how important is that? How much does that play in? And like when should you be thinking about that?
So clearly the size of the market matters. It's one of the key elements of blitzscaling. Remember, it's also about the future value of the market as well as the present value of the market. One of the reasons why a company like Uber put an emphasis on getting into the Middle East is because from a demographic standpoint, the Middle East is younger, population is growing, middle class is emerging. That market is likely to become significantly more valuable over time. Same argument for why people a long time ago said, oh, we need to expand into China, or we need to expand into India. That was the right decision, even though government policy along the way made it difficult to actually make that happen. And so you have to have that long-term future orientation as well. And again, that is yet another dynamic because as a startup, as an entrepreneur, you really need to focus on the short term because you just need to survive. But at the same time, you also want to focus on the long term so that you're not cutting yourself off from huge potential growth in the future. So as always, it's hard.
Okay, Chris, I think that's a good summary of the answer, which is it's hard, and which is why it's such a so useful to talk this through. Right, everyone who's listening, thank you for spending these 33 minutes with us. You obviously have a ton of other business podcasts you could be listening to. Obviously, Chris is the most insightful person on the internet, but we appreciate you being here with us. And Chris, thank you for your time.
Yes, and just to let people know when we're recording it, Happy New Year all, because this is our first recording session of 2024.
That's true. Happy New Year. And if you are having a Happy New Year, please like this video or leave us a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or subscribe. Only if you're having an awesome Happy New Year.
Yes, exactly. We can't require you to give us a high rating, but we know that your having a good new year is correlated with providing a higher rating. So therefore, we are allowed to do that.
Have a great morning and speak next week, Chris.
Thank you, Julien. And next week, you'll be joining me from Bangkok. So we'll be able to talk about that, one of my favorite cities.